Ethiopia was among the first independent nations to sign the Charter of the United Nations, and it gave moral and material support to the decolonization of Africa and to the growth of Pan-African cooperation. These efforts culminated in the establishment of African Union and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, both which have their headquarters in Addis Ababa. In these days, Ethiopia, which is an oldest independent nation, has faced both internal and external threats on its sovereignty. Hello everyone, I am Ahmed, new producer of ATV special program. In our today's program, internal and external threats on the sovereignty of Ethiopia is to be assessed from historical perspectives. And here I am joined by lecturer of history at Bahare University, Dr. Tega Beze. Stay tuned. Thanks for coming here and making time to have this interview session.
Thank you for having me too.
Good. The first question is, Ethiopia has been experiencing lots of internal and external threats that threaten its sovereignty. Could you tell us some of the major ones?
Well, as you have mentioned it, Ethiopia is one of the oldest surviving nations, independent nations in the world. And this independence survived at the cost of many things, many lives. It had experienced different wars which were caused by the attempt to colonize this country or to make it part of their own empire. So we can go as far back as the ancient period to see how Ethiopia tried to defend itself from these foreign aggressions. But the history of Ethiopia in the medieval period and in the modern period could easily illustrate the questions that you have asked. So when it comes to the medieval period, we have a number of threats that Ethiopia experienced to its sovereignty. One of these was the one that was accompanied by internal problems, civil wars during in the first half of the 16th century. Ethiopia was in a state of civil war, and there was what is known in Ethiopian history are the wars of Ahmed, which was fought between 1529 to 1543, and this had threatened the independence of the country as a sovereign, as an independent nation, because there were external sponsors, supporters in this conflict. The forces of Ahmed were supported by the Ottoman Turks and the Yemenite Arabs, who themselves were part of the Ottoman Empire. The Christian Highland Kingdom under Lebanon were supported by the Portuguese. The Portuguese and the Ottoman Turks had their own interests in Ethiopia. So by supporting each group, they wanted to further Ethiopia's, their own national interests. And the impact of this war was the weakening of the Ethiopian central government, or the Highland Christian Kingdom. And it was in this condition that these foreign powers tried to fulfill their own national interests. When you see, for example, the Portuguese had been trying to get an ally in somewhere in the east against the Ottoman Turks. The Ottomans and the Portuguese were competing to dominate the Middle East and the route to the Indian Ocean. So it wanted to establish an ally, a Christian ally, but there was a problem that was created because there were Catholic Christian missionaries who came to Ethiopia following the Portuguese soldiers who were fighting side by side with Lebanon, against the forces of Ahmed. And these Catholic missionaries tried to convert the Orthodox Christians into Catholicism, and this problem reached its important stage, critical stage during the time of Susinius, and that led to civil war, among the Catholics, which were supported by the reigning monarch, that was Susinius, and the Christians were trying to defend their own religion. So Ethiopia's sovereignty was greatly endangered by this incident. By converting to Catholicism, they wanted Ethiopia to be part of the Portuguese Empire, we can say, because the end was not merely religious. There was political intent in that move. So we have this experience during the medieval period. Well, when it comes to the modern period, especially in the 19th century, we have lots of examples. We can take, for example, the encroachments that were made by the Egyptians or the Ottoman Turks before them along the northwestern coastline or border with the Sudan in the 1930s, in the 1940s. And so as a result of that part of Ethiopia's territory was controlled, occupied by the Egyptians. Metemma was part of Ethiopia, so was Kassala for some time. So territorial ambition was there in the northwestern part of Ethiopia, and in the northeastern part of Ethiopia, along the Red Sea coastline, Massawa was controlled, occupied by the Ottoman Turks since, of course, the 17th century, and that continued until the 19th century. So there was this interest in the powers surrounding Ethiopia to control Ethiopia and make them part of their empire. So when we come to the second half of the 19th century, we see serious dangers coming from Egypt and other more powerful nations. Egypt had a very long-lasting, territorial ambition over Ethiopia. It had understood the importance of controlling the source of the Blue Nile since ancient times, and so it was taking every opportunity to achieve that objective, making part of the area of the Blue Nile basin under its control. So in the mid 1870s, that means in 1875 and 76, two major wars were fought between Ethiopia and Egypt, in both of which Ethiopia was victorious at the cost of many lives, of course, but it was able to keep its internal, territorial integrity and sovereignty. After the Egyptians came the Europeans, especially the Italians. They first set their foot at Assab in the late 1860s. In the mid 1880s, they controlled Massawa. They were in fact given by the British. So in their adventure to control Ethiopia, the British supported the Italians. The Italians were more dangerous. They were more energetic. Italy was a newly emerging European power. Its unification was completed in the 1860s, 70s, early 70s. So as a latecomer to the colonial adventure, it was more determined to have its colony in this northeastern African region, and Ethiopia was a target. And as you know, before the Battle of Adwa, there were skirmishes, conflicts between the Ethiopian forces controlling this northern part of Ethiopia. But the major battles were fought at Adwa, and as you know, the result was an Ethiopian victory, which forced the then major European powers to acknowledge Ethiopia as an independent state. So in the 19th century we have this major experience. In the 20th century, still that in external threat was continuing. In 1906, Menelik was ill, you know, and what would happen after the days of Emperor Menelik was a very important issue for Ethiopia and also for the European powers. The Europeans believed that Ethiopia could not survive the days of the emperor, you know. It would disintegrate into smaller units. So they were waiting for that opportunity, you know, to partition Ethiopia among themselves. Especially Britain, France and Italy were working very hard and in concert to achieve their objectives. So we have the 1906 Tripartite Treaty, you know, the treaty between the British, the French and the Italians to partition Ethiopia among themselves in the face of the days of Emperor Menelik, which they expected Ethiopia would disintegrate, you know. So, but after Menelik, Ethiopia survived. You know, there was this succession, though it was somewhat problematic, you know. The transition from Menelik to Haile Selassie or Zewditu was not smooth. There were a lot of, you know, conspiracies and the like, but Ethiopia survived the days of Emperor Menelik and continued as an independent state. So this Italian or British or French interest could not materialize. So, but that does not mean that they have abandoned, you know, their interest on Ethiopia completely. You know, they still continued. They were waiting for any opportune time to take and divide Ethiopia among themselves. So we have also another treaty signed in 1925 and the subsequent years also. But the most important development was the happened in the mid 1930s. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Italy had been strengthening itself, you know, militarily from the time it was defeated at Adwa. That was for about 40 years, you know. For about 40 years, it was taking every opportunity to avenge its defeats at Adwa and turn Ethiopia an Italian colony, you know. So that opportunity came in 1935 when Europe was in a state of political problems. You know, there had been competing powers there, Germany. There was problem between Germany and France, Germany and the British and elsewhere. You know, so Italy saw that as an opportunity to invade Ethiopia, and the consequence of that was military occupation of the country for about 5 years. That is the most important problem Ethiopia faced in the first half of the 19th century. In the 1960s also Ethiopia experienced an external invasion, and that was from a neighborly state, newly established Republic Somalia. You know, Somalia had an irredentist claim, territorial claim over Ethiopia, especially though it was claiming the Somali inhabited regions of Ethiopia. Not only Ethiopia, but Kenya, Djibouti, and also Ethiopia. You know. So it was just immediately after it got its independence that it declared war on Ethiopia and tried to occupy the Ogaden by force. In fact, Ethiopia was able to defend itself, and the intervention of the Organization of African Unity, the newly established continental organization, played an important role in solving the problem, at least temporarily. And but that does not mean that the Somalis have abandoned that claim completely. You know, and for the second time they invaded Ethiopia in 1977, and the war continued for the next 2 years. And this time it was a very dangerous one because Somalia was supported by the great powers. First by the Soviet Union, because Ethiopia was under American influence, and especially during the time of Emperor Haile Selassie. But after the Derg, the powers that took power after or following the demise of the imperial regime, declared socialism at its doctrine. The two great powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, changed sides in supporting the war. This conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia. Somalia came to be supported by the United States, and Ethiopia was supported by the Soviet Union and its allies, Cuba, Yemen Socialist Republic. So they were, in fact, able to inflict heavy damage on Ethiopia because Ethiopia was having its own problems. The military regime was soon established by overthrowing the Haile Selassie regime. There were political groups that were working against the new government. There was the EPRP, the EDU, the EPLF, and the then newly established TPLF. So these all groups were trying to overthrow the government of the Derg, or they have their own interests to achieve. So it was in the face of these internal problems that the Derg or Ethiopia tried to defend itself against this foreign invasion, but it managed to do it, and Somalia was defeated. Ethiopia maintained its territorial integrity, but the civil war continued. EPRP, EPLF, which was trying to secede Eritrea, was supported by the Arab nations, including the Sudan, Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, and then other conservative Middle East states. Was creating problems for the Ethiopian government in the northern part of the country. There was also the newly established TPLF, which was also trying to establish an independent state of Tigray. And there was also EDU, Ethiopian Democratic Union, which had also its own interest to preserve and also to regain. These members of EDU were mainly former landlords whose interests were seriously affected by the measures that the government took, following the overthrow of Haile Selassie. So the civil war continued, and these different elements, insurgent groups, had external sponsors. So Ethiopia had to face these problems by itself. In fact, it was supported to a certain extent by its ideological allies, from the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Union, Cuba, and some other socialist countries had been supporting the government militarily, but it had to stand on its own, to defend itself. It was up to the Ethiopian people, to carry the burden of the civil war. So there have been a lot of problems that Ethiopia has been facing, since ancient times.
Yeah. Thanks for the clarification you gave me, the challenges that Ethiopia has faced since the medieval period up to the present. Now the second question is, Ethiopia is now the oldest independent nation, and how did Ethiopians keep their independence and sovereignty?
The way the Ethiopians tried to defend their independence changed through time. In the ancient and the medieval periods, in the ancient period, they had to depend on themselves. There was no any external support that was coming to their side. In the medieval period, we see some external support. In the case of the Ottomans, the wars of Ahmed. We have the Portuguese who were supporting the forces of Lemna Dengel initially, later Galaudios, who replaced him after his days. But it was up to the Ethiopians, to defend their territorial integrity and independence. There were always competing interests in this region of Ethiopia and the Horn. The geopolitical situations that Ethiopia was in or is in was attracting interests from different groups, you know, from nearby powers or even from governments or states far off, you know, Europe and the United States or other nations, you know. So whenever there is a problem internally, there was a tendency for these these interested groups to intervene in Ethiopian political situation. So they could support either group, you know, either the incumbent government or the force that is struggling against the government. So it was up to the Ethiopian people to defend themselves. But whenever external aggression was experienced, there was this tradition of Ethiopians coming together to defend their motherland. You can take, for example, what happened during the Egyptian invasion of the 1870s. In the mid-1870s, the ruler of Ethiopia was Emperor Johannes IV. He had his seat at Mekelle, or initially at Adwa. But whenever he was faced with this very serious challenge from the Egyptians, by the way, the Egyptians were not alone in their adventure to control Ethiopia or to influence Ethiopia. It was able to use the support or the service of European commanders, you know, military experts, Europeans, Canadians, and other people, you know. So the danger that came from Egypt was a very serious one. So when faced with this serious challenge from the Egyptians, Emperor Johannes called on the rulers of Ethiopia from Gojam, from Wollo, Shoa, and other territories, and mobilized their forces in support of in defense of the nation, you know. So they faced Egyptians as a united force. When you look at, you know, the political situation in Ethiopia, you know, at the time they had their own problems. Menelik had his problems with Johannes. Takla Haymanut had his problems with Menelik and also with Johannes, and so was the condition in other parts of the country, you know. But they set their differences aside, came together, you know, mobilized the people, and faced the enemy in unison, you know. That was what was happening throughout history, be it in the 19th century or earlier or in the 20th century. So Ethiopians were responsible for their own independence, you know. The support that was coming from outside could be more of a diplomatic one, you know, moral one, or counted if they were to support by mobilizing troops, they could be counted in hundreds. For example, you know, when you look at the wars of Ahmed, it was about 400 Portuguese soldiers who came in support of the Christian Highland Kingdom, you know. So it was important from the point of view of, you know, getting that moral support, but it was not decisive in winning the battle, you know. It was up to the people to challenge, you know, this external aggression, you know. So if the experience, you know, this continuous experience of external threats had made Ethiopians to be ready, always ready, remain ready for any eventual invasion that could come from outside. So that had been the case. Whenever there is an external invasion, the emperor would declare or issue an order or mobilize his people. People who have or who had modern arms or traditional weapons come together and face the enemy. That was what was happening in Ethiopia throughout its history.
Good. Now it brings us to the present, or currently Ethiopia is facing internal and external threats, TPLF, the Sudan and Egypt. So how big are these threats?
Yeah, Ethiopia had faced or has been facing a number of problems, some of which were very serious. The one that I mentioned earlier, the Italian invasion of 1896 and 1935-36 were the most important ones when it comes to the survival of Ethiopian independence. The situation in the 1970s, the late 1970s, was also similar. There was internal problem. The government was being challenged by these different insurgent groups, and there is also the external challenge coming from Somalia. So Ethiopia had experienced similar problems in the past. Today we have a very similar problem, we can say, as far as the magnitude of the problem is concerned. We can say it is a very big one, because the forces that are actively involved in the actual fight are supported by a variety of groups from nearby and from afar. We have Egypt, as we have said, the Sudan, which were militarily also supporting these terrorist groups, the TPLF. There are also international organizations and governments who are also pressurizing the Ethiopian government to forcefully accept unfavorable terms, or to sit together with this terrorist group and negotiate, and which is in fact unacceptable by any standards. So the magnitude of the problem is very, very, very great, very large. There is an internal situation which we can call a civil war. We can say it's not a civil war actually. Civil war is a war between peoples, but it is the war that we are having now is a war between TPLF and government forces, Ethiopian government forces. They are trying actually to make it a kind of civil war, but I don't think they can manage to do that. It's a very small group, that is trying to challenge the Ethiopian government, the whole Ethiopian people. In fact, the force that we are facing in TPLF, I'm not undermining its capacity to destabilize the country and also the whole region, because it was a government, it was a group that was ruling the country for the past 30 or so years. So in the course of these years, it had done lots of things to divide the people of Ethiopia and see one another in enmity. That means there are groups that are still supporting the ideas that were propagated by these terrorist groups, the TPLF. In addition to that, it had been able to buy supporters from outside, members of the international organizations, big national influential organizations. There are lobbying groups who are also supporting this terrorist group internationally. in addition to that, because that government was a government that was not keeping the interests of the Ethiopia, or which was simply doing what it was told to do by its external sponsors. These governments are also now supporting the TPLF against the Ethiopian government or Ethiopia. In addition to that, the Egypt and the Sudan, which had very long-standing interests in Ethiopia because of the Nile, the Blue Nile, and also because we share border, common border together, are actively participating in this problem, in aggravating the problem. So it is a very serious one that we are facing today.
There are external forces. What did their stand while Ethiopia faced such a challenge? Could you tell us this from the historical perspective?
Yeah, as I've said, the geopolitical situation that Ethiopia is in attracts interest from different groups, from neighboring countries like the Sudan, Egypt, and other countries around Ethiopia, and also countries like the United States, Europe, or countries from the Far East, in China, Japan, and the like. And because the Red Sea area, this Northeast Africa, and the whole region of Ethiopia, and the whole region of Africa is a very strategic place, a very strategic place. So anyone who controls this area, who influences this area, controls what is going on in the region, in general. So these great powers, in addition to the Ethiopia's neighbors, have always had their eyes on Ethiopia, and what you see today is a continuation of that. There is nothing new in that, So Ethiopia has been experiencing these problems from ancient times, and yeah, when it comes to Egypt and Sudan, we have the Blue Nile issue. They are dependent on the waters of the Nile, especially the Blue Nile, which accounts for about 84% of the volume of the Nile River in general. So they were always having their eyes on Ethiopia. They didn't want anything done on the Blue Nile by the Ethiopian government. So the wars that Ethiopia had fought with these countries in the past were in one way or another related to this issue of the Blue Nile. The other one is the border issue. Ethiopia borders a very large strip of boundary with the Sudan, with the Republic of the Sudan, and so even though we have had territorial treaties, agreements between Ethiopia and the government that ruled the Sudan, they were not actually demarcated on the ground. So there is this boundary issue. But they were taking, the Sudanese were taking this boundary issue to achieve their interests, the interests that they have with regard to the Blue Nile. So Ethiopia is building this Grand Renaissance Dam, which was meant for hydroelectric power, and the Sudanese surely know that they are going to benefit from this dam, but owing to the pressure that was being put on them by the Egyptians, they are supporting adversaries, that means insurgent groups in Ethiopia since very early times, especially today. So TPLF is being supported largely by the Sudan and Egypt, but other foreign powers, European countries, the United States, and other countries who are allied to them are also supporting them. So it is a very complicated situation that we are in. So there are different interest groups in this conflict, in this conflict. There are groups, in fact, which support Ethiopia's cause, It is attempted to generate electric power and solve its development issues, development problems, to feed its own people, and also to solve its own internal problems, keeping its own internal security, stability. So there are groups who support Ethiopia's cause, but there are more powerful powers behind the TPLF, in the name of the Sudan and Egypt, and also other international organizations and governments. So there are these interest groups.
Okay. Now, how we can pass such historical problems?
Yeah, we can learn a lot from our history, Living together for thousands of years has enabled us to develop, this feeling of nationhood, we have a very strong attachment to the land. We have this experience of solving our common problems, such as, for example, dealing with external threats. We could have internal problems. People are free to believe in, to advance their own views as far as the way Ethiopia is governed or administered or whatever. So there are different political groups operating in Ethiopia who have their own share of support from the Ethiopian people. But as we learn from our past, our ancestors have been very wise in putting their differences aside and solve the most important problem first. That means external threat. That threat is endangering the lives of Ethiopians in general, not specific ethnic group or linguistic group. It is going to affect all the people of Ethiopia. So, they set aside their differences, come together and challenge that common enemy or problem. So this is what our ancestors have been doing, and what we have to do today. And we are in fact facing the TPLF as a united front. The TPLF has done lots of things, to bring animosity now among the different peoples of Ethiopia. But they set aside their differences, come together, and they are now trying to challenge this force as a united force. So that is what we have to do. There is no any time when Ethiopia has faced a very serious challenge to the existence of its independence and its keeping of its territorial integrity as this one. So we have to be as united we are trying to face this external challenge. I mean, this challenge that is coming from this TPLF and also its external sponsors.
Good. Now I want you to emphasize that how far unity is important enough with regard to managing the problem that our country Ethiopia has faced right now.
When you look at the history of Ethiopia, most of the problems that came from outside had their roots in Ethiopia. Unless they saw a condition when Ethiopia was having an internal problem, they wouldn't dare to invade that country, because they know they would challenge them together. What we are facing today is there is a group that is waging war against the people of Ethiopia, trying to destabilize Ethiopia and the region in general. There are external sponsors from outside. There are in fact groups that also support the activities of the TPLF, internal elements, some internal elements. But Ethiopians know that the challenge that is coming from the TPLF and its external sponsors is more serious than they are having internally, with the government or with one another. They know that they could be solved, these problems, these differences could be solved peacefully by settling first these external dangers. So when you are divided, your resources are divided, your human and material resources are divided, and these external elements would use to play these divided forces against one another. So and I think the political groups that are operating in Ethiopia have understood this, and they are mobilizing their supporters to support the government's effort to deal with this problem of TPLF first, and then sit down and discuss to solve their internal problems. So I think that is being done today, and there are encouraging signs that what the TPLF has been doing in the past 30 years are being healing. There was a lot of problems that they had caused, and I think it's a very good opportunity to solve these problems that the TPLF was trying to create in dividing the people based on ethnic, linguistic, cultural lines.
Dr. Bezi, thanks for the clarification you gave me regarding the points of discussion we raised so far.
Thank you very much.
Dear viewers, here it brings us to